"You bought the buildings," Vanessa King said, placing a phone in the middle of the table. "You did not buy the people." 7 of New Orleans' most powerful men stared at the glowing screen. Their private conversation was already being broadcast. Federal prosecutors were watching from 3 floors below. These men had terrorized an entire neighborhood, brought down a community hall, and sent Vanessa's 11-year-old son to the hospital. They believed she was only a quiet baker with nowhere left to run. They were wrong. 10 years earlier, the city had known her by another name, the Queen of South Harbor. But that is not where our story begins. Our story begins on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in a small bakery, on a street the rest of the world had already forgotten. Her name, now, was Vanessa King. She was 41 years old, and every morning, 6 days a week, she woke at 4 o'clock in the dark to bake bread. The bakery sat on the corner of Delacroix Row, a narrow street of leaning houses and painted shutters, in one of the oldest and poorest neighborhoods in the city. It was not much to look at. A hand-painted sign that read King's Corner hung above the door. The windows were always fogged with warmth, and from the moment the ovens came alive, the whole block smelled of cinnamon and warm flour, and something like comfort. Vanessa was known, up and down that street, as the gentlest woman anyone had ever met. She learned the name of every child who walked past her window on the way to school. She kept a basket by the back door, and at the end of each day, whatever had not sold, the day-old loaves, the bruised rolls, the muffins that had leaned too far to one side, she wrapped in brown paper and carried down to the underpass, where the men and women, with nowhere else to go, had learned they could count on her. She never asked those men and women a single question. She never made them thank her. She simply set the bread down, wished them a good evening, and walked home. There was an old man named Mr. Abernathy who ran the barber shop 2 doors down, and he liked to say that Vanessa King had never raised her voice in all the years he had known her. Not once, not at a rude customer, not at a late delivery, not at the boys who sometimes kicked a ball against her front window. She would only smile and open the door and offer them something warm. The neighbors loved her for it. But the truth, and this is the first thing you must understand, is that her gentleness was not weakness. It was discipline. It was a choice she made, fresh, every single morning, because Vanessa King knew something the rest of Delacroix Row did not. She knew exactly how much damage a person was capable of doing. She had done it, and she had promised, on the day her son was born, that she would never do it again. That son was the whole reason for the bread, and the basket, and the quiet, and the fog on the windows. His name was Elijah. He was 11 years old. He had his mother's dark, steady eyes and none of her past. He knew nothing of it. To Elijah, his mother was simply the woman who baked, the woman who packed his lunch, the woman who checked his homework at the counter while the last loaves cooled. He had a wide, easy laugh, and he wanted, more than anything, to grow up and build things, bridges, houses, whole streets. He carried a notebook everywhere he went, and in it he drew buildings that did not exist yet. Every night, Vanessa sat on the edge of his bed, and every night she told him the same thing. "You are going to build something that lasts," she said, "and no one is ever going to take it from you." She said it like a promise, but some part of her said it like a prayer. Because Vanessa King had built something once, long ago, and it had been taken from her, and she had lost herself trying to hold on to it. For years, life on Delacroix Row went on, the way it always had, poor but proud, struggling but whole. The families knew one another. They watched one another's children. On summer evenings, they carried chairs out onto the sidewalks and sat together in the heavy, warm air, and if you had walked down that street then, you would have thought that whatever these people did not have in money, they more than made up for in something harder to name. And then the letters came. They arrived on the same morning, in the same crisp white envelopes, at every house on the block. Inside was an offer, a single sheet of paper, from a company called Halcyon Development Partners. The letter was polite. It used soft words. It spoke of revitalization and opportunity, and a bright new future for the historic Delacroix district. And at the bottom of the page was a number, an offer to buy your home, a number that, to families who had never held much money in their lives, looked at first like a small fortune. For a few days there was excitement. There was talk. Old Mr. Abernathy read his letter 3 times and set it on the counter of his barber shop and stared at it. But Vanessa King read her letter only once, and then she set it down very carefully, and she went very still, in a way she had not gone still in 10 years, because Vanessa knew how to read more than words. She had spent half her life reading between them, and what she saw in that soft, polite letter was not opportunity. It was a hand reaching for a throat. The number was too high for a street like Delacroix Row, unless someone intended to make a great deal more from it. And the language was too gentle, the kind of gentle that comes right before something is not gentle at all. She had written letters like that once. She knew what they were for. She said nothing to her neighbors, not yet. She only folded the letter and put it in a drawer and watched. She did not have to watch for long. The families who said no to halcyon development began, one by one, to have trouble. It started small, a grocery store 2 blocks over, the one run by the Tran family, who had come to that street with nothing and built it up over 20 years, found its front window cracked one morning, a long, clean line, as if someone had drawn a knife across the glass. The police were called. Nothing came of it. A week later, a delivery truck the Trans depended on stopped coming, its contract quietly canceled by a supplier who would not explain why. Then the letters stopped being polite. Men began to appear on the block, not many, 2, sometimes 3, well-dressed men in good cars who did not belong there and did not pretend to. They did not shout, they did not threaten, exactly, not in any way you could report. They only knocked on doors and sat in the living rooms of frightened people and spoke in low, reasonable voices about how much simpler life would be for everyone if the paperwork were signed. They mentioned, in passing, how dangerous old neighborhoods could be, how fires started, how accidents happened, how a person really ought to think of their family. And people were afraid. Miss Odessa, who was 83 and had lived in her little green house on Delacroix Row for 60 of those years, signed her letter after 2 of those visits. She did not want to. She cried the day the movers came, but she was one woman, alone, and the fear had gotten into her, and she could not sleep, and finally, she signed just to make the fear stop. Her house sat empty after that, boarded. Then, a month later, it burned in the night. An electrical fault, the report said, though the power had long been shut off. It burned down to nothing, and the lot sat black and open like a missing tooth in the smile of the street. One by one, the families sold, not because they wanted to, because they were tired and frightened and alone, and because the men in the good cars had made it clear that this was a thing that was going to happen, whether they agreed to it or not. Delacroix Row began to empty out, and the people who remained, Mr. Abernathy, the Trans, a handful of others, and Vanessa King, grew quieter and closer and more afraid with every passing week. Through all of it, Vanessa did nothing. She baked her bread. She packed her son's lunch. She wrapped the day-old loaves and carried them to the underpass. When the men in the good cars finally came to her door, and they did come, she answered with flour on her hands and a soft, tired smile, and she told them she would think about it, and she closed the door gently, and she did not sign. They marked her down as a holdout, a stubborn woman, a small problem to be solved later. They had no idea, not the smallest idea, of who they had come to threaten. But Vanessa held her silence, because she had made a promise to her son, because the past was a door she had sworn never to open again. She told herself the neighborhood would find another way. She told herself it was not her fight anymore. She told herself that, right up until the night they hurt her boy, there was one thing left on Delacroix Row that still belonged to everyone. It was called the Delacroix House, an old community center in a wide brick building at the end of the street. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been the heart of the neighborhood. Children did their homework there after school. Old men played cards in the back room. On Sundays, the whole street came together in its big main hall. Halcyon Development wanted that building most of all. It sat, they said, on the most valuable corner of the whole project, and the community would not sell it. It was not one family's to sell. It belonged to all of them, held in the name of the neighborhood itself, and no amount of money and no number of men in good cars could make it sign a letter. So one evening, when the center was full of children, full of the last families of Delacroix Row, full of the small, stubborn hope that they might still hold on to one thing that was theirs, a part of the old building came down. The official word, later, was that it was an accident, a structural failure, an old beam in an old building. But the beam that failed had been sound the week before. A contractor from the neighborhood had inspected it himself and said so, and the men in the good cars had been seen near the building the night before, in the dark, doing something to the supports in the back. When it came down over the corner of the main hall where the children did their homework. Elijah King was under it. He lived. Let me tell you that now, so your heart can rest. He lived. But he was pulled from the dust with a broken arm and a gash along his temple, and he spent 3 days in a hospital bed with his mother beside him, holding his hand, saying nothing, her face as still and gray as stone. Elijah did not understand, in those 3 days, why his mother had gone so quiet. He did not understand why she did not cry. He did not understand the thing that was happening behind her steady, dark eyes. He was a boy. He thought his mother was simply frightened, the way he was frightened. He did not know that on the third night, when he had finally fallen asleep, Vanessa King rose from the chair beside his hospital bed. He did not know that she stood at the window a long time, looking out over the city lights. He did not know that somewhere, deep beneath 10 years of flour and cinnamon and gentleness, something old and terrible and patient opened its eyes. The people who had done this had made a simple mistake. It is the oldest mistake there is. They had mistaken a woman's peace for a woman's weakness. They were about to learn the difference. To understand what happened next, you have to know who Vanessa King had been before she was Vanessa King at all. 10 years earlier, in a rougher and darker part of that same city, down along the docks and warehouses of a district everyone called South Harbor, there had been a woman that people spoke about only in low voices, and only when they were sure of who was listening. They called her the Queen. She had not been born to power. She had come up out of nothing, out of a childhood that would break most people, and she had survived it by being smarter and colder and steadier than anyone around her. She had a mind for numbers that could see a lie in a ledger from across a room. She had a memory that forgot nothing, and she had a gift, rare and dangerous, for understanding exactly what every person in a room wanted, and exactly what every person in a room feared. She did not rule South Harbor with force. That was the thing people never understood about her. There were harder men than her, stronger men, more violent men, and she had outlasted every one of them. She ruled with information. She ruled with debts and favors and secrets carefully kept. She ruled because she always knew more than the person across the table. By the time she was 30, there was not a business or a boss or a crooked official in that whole district who did not, in some quiet way, answer to her. And she had rules. That was the other thing. The Queen of South Harbor had rules, and she kept them, and everyone knew what they were. She did not touch families. She did not touch children. She did not deal in the things that destroyed people from the inside. Her world was hard, and it was not clean, and she carried the weight of that to her grave. But within it, she held a line, and she never once crossed it. There was a man in that world she trusted. His name was Dominic Vale. He had been at her side for years. Her right hand, the one man she believed she could turn her back on. And she was wrong. When power is on the table, there is no such thing as a back you can safely turn. Dominic Vale betrayed her. The details do not matter now. The shape of it is old as the world. He wanted what she had, and he thought he could take it, and he made his move at the moment he judged her weakest. And she was weak, in that moment, but not for the reason he thought. She was weak because she was newly, secretly, and completely a mother. Because she was holding, in her arms, a few weeks after his birth, a son, a boy named Elijah, and in the space of one terrible night, looking down at that child while the world she had built came apart around her, Vanessa understood something that changed the entire direction of her life. She understood that if she stayed, if she fought Dominic Vale the way the old Vanessa would have fought him, and won, and took back her throne, then her son would grow up in that world. He would grow up the child of the queen, and one day, someone would come for him the way Dominic had come for her. So she did the one thing no one in that world had ever seen anyone do. She walked away. She did not fight Dominic Vale for the throne. She let him have it. She gathered what she could carry, and she took her son, and in a single night, she disappeared so completely that the entire underworld of that city believed, for years, that the Queen of South Harbor was dead. She took a new name. She took a small apartment in a poor and quiet neighborhood at the far end of the city, a place called Delacroix Row, where no one from her old life would ever think to look. She learned to bake bread from a kind old woman who owned a failing corner shop, and when that woman passed, Vanessa took over the shop and made it hers. And she made a vow, the deepest vow of her life. She vowed that her son would never know who his mother had been, that he would grow up gentle, in a gentle place, believing the world was kind, because she would spend every day of her life making it kind for him. For 10 years, she kept that vow. For 10 years, the queen was buried, and only Vanessa King remained. And then a corporation with soft white letters and men in good cars came to Delacroix Row, and they threatened her neighbors, and they burned Miss Odessa's house. And, in the end, they put her son in a hospital bed. They did not know that the quiet baker they had marked down as a small problem had once held an entire city in the palm of her hand. They did not know that she had never lost the skill. She had only set it down. And now, in a hospital room in the middle of the night, with her sleeping son's hand in hers, Vanessa King reached back across 10 years and picked it up again. There is a certain kind of person who, when they are pushed too far, becomes loud. They shout, they threaten, they break things. That kind of person is not truly dangerous. Their anger burns hot and burns out. Vanessa King was the other kind. When Elijah came home from the hospital, his arm in a cast, she did not say a word about what had happened. She settled him on the couch and made his favorite soup and told him a story until he fell asleep. And then, when the house was quiet, she went to the back of her closet and she took down a garment bag that had hung there, untouched, for 10 years. Inside was a suit. A black suit, sharply cut, the kind of thing no one on Delacroix Row had ever seen her wear. She had kept it all this time. She had never been able to say why. Perhaps some part of her had always known that this day might come. She did not put it on, not yet. The suit was for the end. First came the work. And the work, for Vanessa King, had never been violence. Let me be clear about that, because it is the whole heart of this story. In all her years as the Queen of South Harbor, her true power had never been the thing people feared. Her true power had been what she knew. And knowledge, unlike force, does not fade with time. It only waits. She began with a telephone call. There was a man named Solomon Grady. Once, long ago, he had been her lawyer, a brilliant, careful man who had helped her build and hold her world, and who had, like her, walked away from it to try to live a cleaner life. He was old now and semi-retired, and when he heard her voice on the phone after 10 years of silence, he was quiet for a long moment. "I thought you were gone," he finally said. "I was," she answered. "I need you to help me come back. Just once. Just far enough to finish something." And she told him what had happened on Delacroix Row, and Solomon Grady, who had a granddaughter of his own, listened to the whole of it, and at the end he said, "Tell me what you need." What she needed was to understand Halcyon Development Partners the way she had once understood everything. And so she went to work in the only way she ever truly had, patiently, invisibly, following the money. She reached out to an old friend named Camille Boudreau, who had once kept the books for half of South Harbor, and could read a financial record the way other people read a face. Camille was a grandmother now, running a small diner across town, and she owed Vanessa nothing, but she came anyway, because there are debts of the heart that never appear in any ledger. Together, at Vanessa's kitchen table, long after Elijah was asleep, the two women began to pull Halcyon Development apart, one document at a time. And what they found was rot. Beautiful, complicated, expensive rot. Halcyon Development Partners was not a normal company. It was a shell, a clean and shining front, and behind it ran a maze of hidden accounts and false companies, and money that flowed in from places that did not want their names known. The neighborhood on Delacroix Row was not the point. It was never the point. The point was the rot beneath it, the money that needed a place to hide, and a redevelopment project that could make dirty money look clean. And to make it all work, Halcyon had bought people. That was the part that mattered. They had bought a city building inspector who had signed off on things he should not have signed. They had bought a councilman named Harlan Pike who had steered contracts and zoning decisions their way in exchange for quiet payments through those false companies. The whole rotten thing depended on a small handful of men in positions of trust, telling small lies that added up to a very large crime. Vanessa found them all. She and Camille traced every dollar, mapped every false company, named every bought official. It took weeks. It took 100 late nights. And at the center of the maze, where the deepest and darkest money flowed, they found the name of the man who truly owned Halcyon Development Partners. The man behind the men in the good cars. The man who had ordered the letters and the fires and the beam that came down over the children of Delacroix Row. Vanessa read that name, and for the first time in the whole long month, the stillness on her face broke. It was Vale, Julian Vale, the younger brother of Dominic Vale, the man who had betrayed her 10 years before. She sat with that name a long time. The older brother, Dominic, was long gone. The world he stole from her had eaten him alive in the end, as that world always does. But the younger brother had watched, and learned the wrong lessons, and grown up hungry. Julian Vale had taken the family appetite and dressed it in a good suit. He had traded the docks of South Harbor for a corporate tower downtown. He had traded the men with knives for men with contracts. But underneath the clean white letters and the soft language, it was the same old hunger, the same reaching hand at the same exposed throat. And Julian Vale knew exactly who Vanessa King had been. He had known all along. That was the thing that turned Vanessa's blood cold. He had chosen Delacroix Row on purpose. He had known the Queen of South Harbor was buried there under an apron and a false name, and he had come to her neighborhood believing that she would never rise. Because, and this was his whole gamble, his one great certainty, Julian Vale believed that becoming a mother had made her weak. He believed that the woman who had once ruled a city would sit quietly and watch her street burn, because she had a son to protect and too much to lose. He believed that motherhood was the leash that would keep the queen forever on her knees. He had it exactly backwards, and Vanessa understood, in that moment, that this was the deepest truth of the whole affair, the truth she would build everything upon. Motherhood had not made her weak. It had shown her what strength was actually for. The old Vanessa, the queen, would have destroyed Julian Vale in a single night, the old way, the hard way, and taken his rotten empire for her own, and told herself it was justice. And she would have become, once again, exactly the thing she had spent 10 years running from. She would have won, and in winning she would have lost her son, and lost herself, and the whole terrible circle would have closed again. She was not going to do that. She sat at her kitchen table in the small hours of the morning with the whole rotten map of Halcyon Development spread before her, and she made a decision that only a mother could make. She was not going to end Julian Vale in order to take his throne. She was going to end the throne itself. She was going to burn down the entire game, the one that had made the Vales and the one that had made her, so that no one would ever have to grow up in it again. She would not use a single act of violence. She would not break a single law. She would use the one weapon she had always been the master of. The truth, all of it, at once, in front of the whole world. She looked at Solomon Grady, who had been sitting across the table, watching her face change. "I know how this ends," she said, "but I need to get them all in one room, speaking freely, and I need the right people watching when they do." Solomon nodded slowly. "You want to give it to the prosecutors. I want to give it to everyone," she said. The rest, she arranged the way she had once arranged everything, quietly, carefully, and completely. Through Solomon Grady, she reached an assistant United States attorney named Naomi Cole, a hard and honest prosecutor who had spent 3 frustrated years trying to find a way into the exact kind of financial rot that Halcyon Development was built from, and who had never had the evidence to do it. Vanessa gave her the map, weeks of it, Every account, every false company, every bought official, laid out so cleanly that Naomi Cole later said it was the finest piece of financial detective work she had ever seen in her career, and that she never did learn who had truly assembled it. Through Camille, she reached a young reporter named Theo Ramsey, who had grown up 2 streets over from Delacroix Row, who had watched his own grandmother pushed out of her home by a company just like this one, and who had been waiting his whole young career for a story exactly like this to walk through his door. And through her own old world, because some debts in that world are never forgotten, she reached the one place where Julian Vale believed himself completely safe. There was a restaurant, downtown, called the Camellia Room. It was old, and it was elegant, and it was where the powerful men of that city met to divide up the things they intended to take. Julian Vale kept a private dining room there. He believed it was the most secure place in the city, swept for listening devices, guarded, discreet. But the Camellia Room had belonged, once, to Vanessa's world. The old man who owned it had, 30 years before, been shown a great mercy by a young woman down in South Harbor, a mercy that saved his family and his business at the darkest moment of his life. He had never forgotten it, and when a quiet woman he had not seen in 10 years came to see him and told him what she needed and why, he did not hesitate for even a moment. Vanessa did not need to sneak a single device into that room. She simply needed the man who owned it to say yes. And then she did the last thing. The thing that no one expected. The thing that turned the whole trap from a quiet legal maneuver into something the entire city would never forget. She let Julian Vale invite her. She sent word, through the men in the good cars, that the stubborn baker of Delacroix Row was finally ready to talk, that she understood now that she could not win, that she wanted to negotiate the sale of her bakery, the last holdout on the street, in person, with the man in charge, as a matter of respect. Julian Vale was delighted. Of course he was. To him it was the final, satisfying proof of everything he believed. The Queen had come, at last, to her knees. He set the meeting for the following week, in his private room at the Camellia Room, and he invited his partners to witness it. The Councilman Harlan Pike, the men who had funneled the hidden money, the whole rotten inner circle, so they could all watch, together, the last resistance on Delacroix Row finally break. He gathered every guilty man in the whole affair into a single room, of his own free will to gloat. He had no idea he was setting the table for his own ending. The night came. Elijah King was staying with the Tran family that evening, safe, watched over, his arm still in its cast. Before she left, Vanessa sat with him a while, and checked his homework at the counter the way she always did, and told him she had a bit of business to see to and would be home before he woke. He believed her, because he had never in his life had a reason not to. At the door, he looked up at her, really looked, and something in her face that night must have been different, because he said, "Mom, is everything okay?" She knelt down to his level and took his good hand in both of hers. "Everything is going to be okay," she said. "I promise you that. Whatever you hear, tomorrow or after, I promise you it's going to be okay. Do you trust me?" "Always," he said. "Good," she said. "Now build me something wonderful in that notebook while I'm gone." And then she went home to an empty house, and she opened the garment bag that had hung untouched for 10 years, and for the first time in a decade, Vanessa King put on the black suit. She stood in front of the mirror a long moment. The woman looking back at her was not the gentle baker of Delacroix Row, and she was not the cold queen of South Harbor either. She was something new, something the 10 years had made, a woman with a mother's heart and a queen's mind, and no fear at all left anywhere inside her. She drove downtown, she parked. She walked up to the doors of the Camellia Room in a plain black coat over the black suit, and the old man who owned it met her himself, and bowed his head to her the way you bow to something you have not seen in a very long time, and led her up the stairs. Down in a quiet room 3 floors below, Naomi Cole sat with 2 other federal prosecutors and a stack of warrants, watching a screen. In a car outside, Theo Ramsey sat with his laptop open and a live broadcast ready to go, connected to feeds that would reach the city desk of every newspaper in the state, the offices of the city council, and anyone else in the whole city who cared to watch. Vanessa had seen to all of it. Every important person who needed to be watching was watching. She reached the top of the stairs. She handed her coat to the old man, and she opened the door. 7 powerful men sat around the long table, certain they had already won. Julian Vale sat at the head of it, a handsome, well-fed man in an expensive suit, a man who had never in his life been afraid of anything, because he had always been the most dangerous person in the room. He was not the most dangerous person in the room anymore. When the door opened, he looked up with an easy, victorious smile, expecting a broken baker come to sign her name. And then he saw the suit, and he saw her face, and the smile fell off his own face like something dropped from a great height. The gray-haired man near the end of the table, the building inspector, lifted his wine glass to his lips out of pure habit, and his hand shook so badly that the glass slipped and shattered on the marble floor. No one moved to clean it. No one even looked down. Every man at that table had gone the specific, terrible kind of still that a person goes when they realize the ground beneath them has quietly disappeared. Because the older men in that room, the money men, the men who had come up in the old world, knew that face. They had heard about the day the Queen of South Harbor vanished, and they had never quite believed she was dead. And now here she was, in the black suit, 10 years later, standing in the doorway of the one room where they had believed themselves untouchable. Vanessa King did not raise her voice. She had never once, in her entire life, needed to. She looked slowly around the table, at every guilty face, one by one, and she let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. And then she spoke, and she said only one thing. "You bought the buildings," she said. "You did not buy the people." Julian Vale tried to recover. He was a Vale, after all. The hunger in him did not know how to do anything but reach. He forced a laugh, and spread his hands, and said something about how nice it was that she'd dressed up, and how a costume didn't change the fact that she was a baker now, a nobody, a woman with a son to think about and everything to lose. He made, in that moment, the same mistake his brother had made 10 years before. He believed the son was her weakness. Vanessa let him talk. She let him say all of it, every arrogant, incriminating word, and as he talked, she walked slowly around the table, and she began, quietly, to lay the whole thing out. She named the false companies. She named the false companies. She named the money and where it came from and where it went. She turned to the councilman, Harlan Pike, and named the exact amounts he had been paid and the exact decisions he had sold. She turned to the building inspector and named the reports he had signed, and the beam he had known was compromised, the beam that had come down over the children of Delacroix Row, over her own son. She named it all, from memory, without a single note, in a calm and level voice, the way you might read a grocery list. And with every name, every number, every account, the men around the table grew paler, and more silent, and more afraid. Because it was all true. Every word of it was true. And the only way she could know it, the only way anyone could know it in such perfect and total detail, was if the whole thing was already finished. Already documented. Already, somehow, out of their hands. Julian Vale stopped smiling. "Who are you working with?" he said, and his voice had gone quiet and ugly. "Who's outside?" Vanessa reached the head of the table, where he sat, and she looked down at him. "Everyone," she said. And she took a small phone from the pocket of the black suit, and she set it on the table in front of him, face up. And it was not recording, it was broadcasting, and had been from the moment she opened the door. Live. To 3 federal prosecutors in the building beneath them. To a young reporter in a car outside, whose feed had already reached the city desk of every newspaper in the state. To the offices of the city council. To anyone in that whole city who was watching a screen that night. Every arrogant word Julian Vale had spoken. Every name Vanessa had recited. Every guilty, silent face at that table. All of it. Already gone out into the world. Already impossible to bury. Already beyond the reach of any amount of money, or any man in any good car. The room understood, all at once, that it was over. There is a small thing that happened in that moment that Vanessa did not know about until later, and it is the part of the story she treasured most. Her son was there. Elijah, at the Tran family's home, had grown worried in a way he could not explain. When the first fragments of the broadcast began to appear, when the neighborhood's phones began to light up with the impossible news that something was happening downtown, that the company was falling, that a woman was taking it apart in real time, old Mr. Tran had bundled the boy into his truck and driven downtown, not to interfere, only because the boy would not be still, only because a child knew, in the way children sometimes know, that his mother was at the center of the storm. They arrived as the federal officers were going in, and in the confusion and the crowd, Elijah slipped up the stairs, and he stood in the open doorway of that private room, unseen, and he watched. He watched his mother, his gentle mother, the woman who baked bread and packed his lunch and checked his homework at the counter, stand in a room full of the most powerful and frightening men he had ever seen, in a black suit he had never known she owned, and hold every one of them frozen in place with nothing but her voice and the truth. He did not understand all of it. He was 11, but he understood the one thing that mattered, the thing he would carry for the rest of his life. He had spent his whole childhood believing his mother was gentle because she was soft, and in that doorway, in that moment, he understood that he had it exactly backwards. His mother was gentle because she was strong, so strong that she had no need to be anything else, so strong that she had chosen, every single day of his life, to build a small, warm world out of bread and kindness, when she could have ruled a cold one instead. That was the night Elijah King learned that his mother was not weak, and it was the night he began, without yet having the words for it, to understand what she had given up, and why, and for whom. The federal officers came in a few minutes later. There was no violence. There was never going to be any violence. That was the whole point, the whole shape of the thing Vanessa had built. There was only paperwork, and handcuffs, and quiet men being led down a grand staircase in their expensive suits, while a young reporter's camera caught every step. Julian Vale, as he was led past her, stopped. He looked at Vanessa with something between hatred and disbelief. "You could have had all of it," he said. "You could have taken the whole thing. Why do this?" And Vanessa King looked at him, the last hungry Vale, the reaching hand at the end of a long line of reaching hands, with something that was almost, but not quite, pity. "Because I have a son," she said. "And I decided he was going to grow up in a world that had one less of you in it." Then she walked past him, and she did not look back, and she went to the doorway where her boy was standing, and she knelt down, and she took him into her arms, cast and all, and she held him for a very long time, while the whole rotten empire of halcyon development came apart around them. The days that followed were a storm, but it was a clean storm, and when it passed, the sky over Delacroix Row was clear in a way it had not been in a very long time. The case was, in the end, one of the largest of its kind the city had ever seen. Julian Vale and every man at that table faced the consequences of what the whole world had watched them admit. The councilman, Harlan Pike, resigned in disgrace and faced charges of his own. The building inspector, the moneymen, the men in the good cars, all of it unraveled, thread by thread, exactly as Vanessa had known it would once the truth was set loose. Halcyon Development Partners collapsed completely, and the great predatory plan for Delacroix Row collapsed with it. But Vanessa was not finished, because tearing something down had never been the point. She was the kind of person who had learned, the hardest way there is, that the only thing worth having power for is what you build with it once the fight is over. The properties Halcyon had bought up, the empty houses, the burned lots, the boarded shops, were tangled in the collapse of the company, caught up in the legal wreckage. And here, once again, Vanessa King did the quiet, patient, invisible work she had always been the master of, working with Solomon Grady and with the Assistant U.S. Attorney Naomi Cole, and with a city council that was suddenly very eager to be seen doing the right thing. She helped guide those properties into the hands of the one owner who could never be bought out, never be frightened, never be pushed off a street, the neighborhood itself. They created a community trust. Every remaining family on Delacroix Row held a share in it, and no share could ever be sold to any outside company, ever again. The land belonged, now and forever, to the people who lived on it. The reaching hands could never again find the throat, because there was no longer a single throat to reach for, only a whole community, holding on to one another. together. And then Vanessa did the thing that people on that street still talk about to this day. The empty buildings, the ones Halcyon had bought to tear down, Vanessa turned into something new. She took the largest of them, the ones that had been meant to become luxury towers on the bones of a poor neighborhood, and she opened, in their place, a set of trade schools. Not fancy ones, real ones, workshops, a place where the young people of that neighborhood, the ones the world had already written off, the ones most at risk of being pulled into the very world Vanessa had once ruled, could come and learn a trade: carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, baking, in one warm corner that smelled always of cinnamon. A place where a young person with nothing but their two hands could learn to build something that lasted, and to make a life that no one could ever take away from them. She knew those young people. She knew, better than anyone alive, the exact shape of the road that leads a person from having nothing into a world of good cars and soft letters and reaching hands. She had walked that road herself, all the way to the throne at the end of it, and she built those schools to give the next generation a different road, a longer, harder, better road that led somewhere else entirely. She never went back to being the queen. The black suit went back into the garment bag at the back of the closet, and this time she knew, at last, why she had kept it, not to wear it again, but to remember who she had been, and to be sure she never became that person again. She went back to the bakery. She went back to the 4 o'clock mornings, and the fog on the windows, and the smell of warm bread, and the basket by the back door that the men and women at the underpass could always count on. She went back to being Vanessa King, the gentlest woman on Delacroix Row. But something was different now, and everyone felt it. The street stood a little taller. The families who had almost lost everything looked at the quiet baker on the corner, with a new kind of understanding in their eyes. And the young people who came out of her schools, carpenters and electricians and builders, boys and girls with trades and futures and their heads held high, they knew that they owed the whole shape of their lives to a woman who never once told them what she had done for them. Elijah King grew up. He never became a builder of the kind he had drawn in his boyhood notebook exactly. He became something better. He grew up in the community his mother had saved, learning his trades in the schools his mother had built, and he grew into a good and steady man who spent his life building homes for people who could not otherwise afford them. He knew, by then, the whole story. His mother had told him, when he was old enough, all of it, the Queen and South Harbor, and the night she walked away, holding him. She had decided, in the end, that he should not grow up believing his mother was only gentle. She wanted him to know what the gentleness had cost, and what it was worth, and where it had come from. And when he asked her, once, whether she ever missed it, the power, the throne, the world where a single word from her could move an entire city, she thought about it for a long, honest moment, and then she shook her head. "When I was the queen," she said, "the most powerful thing I had was that people were afraid of me, and I have learned, since then, that being feared is a very small kind of power. It is the smallest kind there is. Anyone hard enough and cruel enough can make people afraid." She looked out the fogged window of the bakery, at the street she had saved, at the young people walking to the schools she had built. "The greatest power there is," she said, "is not the power to make people afraid. It is to be strong enough to end their fear, to stand in the doorway and stop the thing that is coming, and let them sleep. That is the only kind of power worth having, and I was never strong enough to have it until I had you. So the next time you meet someone quiet, someone gentle, someone who packs the lunches and bakes the bread and never raises their voice, someone the world has decided is soft and small and easily pushed aside, remember the woman in the black coat, standing in the doorway of the finest room in the city, with the whole world watching, saying the words that ended an empire. You bought the buildings, you did not buy the people. Remember that the loudest people are rarely the strongest. Remember that some of the most powerful souls who ever lived chose, every single morning, to set that power down, and to bake bread instead, and to build warm, small worlds for the people they loved. And remember that they can pick it up again, in a single night, when someone they love is threatened, and that when they do, no amount of money, and no man in any good car, will ever be able to stand in their way." The greatest power in the world is not the power to make others afraid. It is to be strong enough to end the fear altogether. And that is a kind of strength that no one can ever buy, and no one can ever take, and no one, no matter how hungry, no matter how powerful, should ever, ever mistake for weakness.